Glad everybody's here with us. Thanks for joining us. We are WeatherOps. I've got Steve Strum and Mike Gothier with me. I'm Randy Vandeweghe, and we're going to do our mid-season hurricane season update. It feels like it's been a quiet hurricane season so far. In all actuality, it actually hasn't. We'll get into that here in just a little bit. But we're going to chat about what we expect this for the remaining second half. We're approaching the peak of the season. And we'll talk about a few of the tools that WDT and WeatherOps can provide to go through, if hurricanes strike, getting all the info that you need. So again, we're real excited to have you with us. We invite you to ask questions at the bottom of the webinar screen. There is a Q&A button that you can tap and type in questions. We will follow along with those and ask those as we go through the webinar, so we encourage you to do that as well. As we get going, we're going to go ahead and turn it now to Steve Strum. Steve is our long-range forecasting expert here at WDT, and he's going to give an update on what to expect for this hurricane season.
Well, yeah, thanks, Rennie. Again, it has seemed like a quiet season. Of course, we are just now kind of getting into the typical peak part of the hurricane season. Let's see if I can get my slides to go. There we go. So right now, yes, we're almost towards that middle 2-month period between middle of August and middle of October, where we see the bulk of our activity. So typically we don't actually see a lot prior to mid-August in most years. So even though it has been, fairly quiet, that's really pretty typical for most hurricane seasons. Now, obviously, years like last year were a little bit more active already. And, some of the big years like 2015 or 2005 rather, where we saw just, dozens of storms, those years obviously tend to have sort of a broader peak to the season and more activity early on. But, for the average hurricane season, we typically see 8 of our named storms and 4 of our hurricanes occur between now and the middle of October, which is really the bulk of the activity that you typically see. So we're just now getting into that period of time where things really get active across the tropics, and we typically see most of our major hurricanes take place. You don't usually see very many major hurricanes take place prior to mid-August. So we are kind of getting into that season now where the water is getting warm enough to where it does become more of a concern to see not just a hurricane, but also a much stronger hurricane. Those high-end hurricanes are typically associated with that peak of the warmth that we see in the ocean, which is typically occurring in late August through the first half of September. And that warm water helps to really drive the intensity of our hurricanes that we see during that time. Now, again, we have had 5 named storms and 2 hurricanes so far this year. Really no major U.S. impacts. We did have 1 landfall with Alberta, which was actually a subtropical storm at the time. But again, typically at this time of the year, we've only seen 3 to 4 named storms and 1 or 2 hurricanes. So we're pretty much on par to actually a little bit ahead of average in terms of actual storm numbers. Again, though, we haven't had any strong, long-lived storms for the most part. So, we haven't had those big events yet. But again, we are just entering the heart of the hurricane season, so that likely will change going forward. So certainly not quite, to the point that we were at last year. Last year was actually, at this point in time, was when Harvey got going. And obviously, that really kicked off a period of very active weather last hurricane season. And so we're not seeing that happening right now. We have a storm out there right now, but it's, for the most part, fairly moderate and not really affecting any land areas. So we aren't really seeing those major impacts right now across the U.S. or the Gulf of Mexico that we saw happening at this time last year. So again, looking at historically here, the overall trend that we've seen in past years, we've obviously had a lot of activity in most hurricane seasons since about 1995 or so. That coincides with a period of time when the Atlantic basin in general has been running a lot warmer than it has historically. Prior to 95, much of the Atlantic was running cooler than average in many areas, and since then it's been generally running warmer than average. This year, though, is a little bit different. We'll talk about that in a minute. We've seen some areas kind of revert back to sort of a cooler regime in the tropical part of the Atlantic Ocean. So that's one reason why this year is not really running quite as active as some of these past years have been. And the reason, again, that we have had this sort of slight decrease in activity this year is that we've had a stronger than average high pressure over the Atlantic basin. That big H there, kind of up there in the east central Atlantic, has been stronger than average. The colors there on the map indicate how anomalous the pressure has been. So all those greens and yellows and oranges indicate that we've seen stronger than average high pressure across the Atlantic basin this year. And the circulation around that high basically drives north winds down the west coast of Africa. And then you have east to west flow across the tropical portions, and then a stronger south to north flow up the east coast of the U.S., and that in turn helps also circulate the water faster in that direction. And so we're seeing a stronger flow of water going down the west coast of Africa, which of course is bringing cooler water down from near Europe down towards the tropics, and then that water flows westward across the tropics. So we've been seeing those parts of the central and eastern tropical Atlantic be cooler this year because of that stronger circulation, while at the same time we've driven more warm water towards the Gulf and more warm water up the east coast. So if we actually look at the water temperature anomalies here on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see again that pretty much follows what we just looked at with the circulation around that high pressure. So temperatures sort of in that eastern and central part of the tropical Atlantic are running, somewhat below normal this year, not exceptionally so, but those areas were actually warmer than normal last year. And so we've actually come down quite a bit from where we were at this point last year. At the same time, that stronger circulation has also driven a lot more warm water up towards New England and then eastward across the northern parts of the Atlantic basin, and also again towards the Gulf of Mexico. So the Gulf is running pretty warm this year, and so that is going to be a concern going forward if we do see a hurricane move into the central Gulf where the water is running pretty solidly above normal, over a degree Celsius above normal. That means any storm that goes in there will have more fuel to work with, and would potentially become stronger than it otherwise would be because of that warmth that's present there and the extra energy that's available to a storm because of that warmth in the water there. So we are looking again at those patterns close to the U.S. as being a concern for storms that do impact the U.S., since there is going to be a lot of energy there. At the same time, the cooler water out in the Atlantic down there east of the Caribbean is kind of limiting the development so far of these tropical waves that do move westward across the Atlantic basin. And also that stronger circulation has been bringing more Saharan dust, more dry air off the Sahara across the Atlantic, and that also has been limiting development thus far this year. Now, we are seeing the overall pattern become a little bit more conducive. Again, we have Ernesto up there in the north central Atlantic, and the colors here indicate areas where conditions are more favorable for tropical development right now today. And we've been seeing a general expansion of that in recent days. And that's pretty typical for this time of the year. Typically, you see the overall levels of wind shear decrease, the water is getting warmer, and generally there's less dry air around this time of the year. And so we are seeing a gradual shift towards regime that should allow for more tropical development going forward. And again, that's typical for this time of the year. Now, again, this year is not a year that's very favorable overall for tropical activity, though. The map on the left-hand side there kind of shows a typical pattern you would see with water temperatures with the La Nina in place in the eastern Pacific, that cold water there in the Pacific, and the tropical Atlantic being warmer than normal. This year is kind of, we have that cooler, it's not quite opposite, but we do have a cooler than average tropical Atlantic, and we're not quite into an El Nino mode at this point. We're still kind of in a neutral ENSO regime, but that tropical Pacific is definitely warmer than what you typically see during the very active hurricane seasons. And we are seeing a warming trend in that area, and most climate models do still forecast a gradual trend towards El Nino by the end of the year. But it isn't really getting going at the moment, and so it's not probably going to have a huge impact on the hurricane season, but it likely may have some impact of kind of curtailing activity on the back end of the season. So perhaps October into November may be a little bit less active than normal just from the ENSO impacts if we do see the El Nino kind of get ramped up here in the coming weeks. Now, again, a lot of climate models still do tend to forecast an El Nino developing as we head towards the latter part of the year. But again, this year is a little bit different than it was like in 2015 when we had an El Nino in place already at this point in time. And so because the El Nino is developing kind of late in the year, it's not really going to be into that sort of full El Nino mode until the very end of the hurricane season. So the overall impact won't be as great as it was in a 2015 or 2009 type of year where we had the activity going a lot sooner than we are this year. So these are the averages that you typically see during an El Nino or a neutral ENSO year or a La Nina year. Typically, the El Nino years are the quietest years overall. The La Nina years and the neutral years seem to be a lot more active. Now, there's some averages there that show the averages since 1950 as well as the averages since 1995. And that's broken down that way because, again, we've had that period of warmer water in the Atlantic since 95. Also, there's just a difference in terms of sensing storms. We have a lot better technology today, so we tend to see more storms developing than we did back in the 50s because we have better satellite data and that kind of thing too. So we do typically see more storms now than we did back in the 50s and 60s just because of that aspect alone. So overall, recent trends are a little bit higher than the past trends, but you can see, generally speaking, that if we do see an El Nino developing, that would kind of tend to favor, 11 named storms, 5 hurricanes for a typical year. But again, we don't have the El Nino in place just yet, so that likely kind of provides a baseline. And most likely, we should see a total that comes in somewhat higher than those El Nino averages suggest. Now, again, the main kind of factor in the Atlantic that's kind of reducing activity is that cooler water, the stronger high pressure there in the Atlantic basin that's kind of producing those stronger surface winds, pulling in more of that drier air westward from Africa and so forth. And so that we are seeing a general trend that's not as favorable in general as what we saw last year, certainly, and in general compared to the last 5 or 10 years. So overall activity is not going to be likely as active as it has been in recent years, but again, still running pretty close to that long-term average, if not a little bit above. So we're still looking at potentially an additional, several storms coming up here. We're forecasting, oops, it looks like we skipped ahead there one slide. An additional 7 to 8 storms before the end of the hurricane season. So a total of around 12 to 13. Again, we're at 5 right now. For hurricanes, an additional 3 to 5 hurricanes, or a total of 5 to 7. We're currently sitting at 2 hurricanes in total for the year. And we haven't had any major hurricanes yet, but likely we'll still see 2 or 3 major hurricanes get going before the end of the season. Typically, most of those tend to happen during September into early October in the average hurricane season. So we're not, it's typical to have those happen a little bit later on in the season than what we've seen this year. And so the fact that we haven't had a major hurricane thus far really is actually pretty typical. But again, as we head towards September, the risk for a major storm is going to be higher. And again, with that warmer than normal Gulf of Mexico, we are going to be concerned about any storm that does actually move into the Gulf, since again, it will have a lot of warm water to work with, a lot more energy than average to work with. And so there is going to be a risk still, even though it could be a quiet overall year, if we do see a storm move into the Gulf, it could still become a major storm there and have a major impact on the U.S. if it does track in that direction. So that's the main story this year. Again, not as active as the last couple of years, but certainly still a little bit above average overall. And again, still a potential to have a major impact on the U.S. this year before the season is over. So Mike, you can take it away and show us some of the tools and products we have that can kind of help you utilize that information on your decision making going forward this season.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Randy, anything you want to add to that before I jump in? Or?
Yeah, I was just going to ask one quick question. So given that there's some cooler water off of the coast of Africa where we
Sure.
tend to get those waves that form, they're kind of long duration storms, what do you think the prospects are of having some storms kind of growing close to home, kind of like a Harvey did?
Right.
Storms in the Gulf. I mean, we know the Gulf is in a pretty prime condition for development. So what do you foresee?
Well, the fact that it is cooler out there can sometimes increase that risk for a storm to actually impact the U.S. because typically you'll see storms that develop way out in the eastern Atlantic. There is more potential for them to get pulled northward by troughs in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that pass by. It takes a good week to get across the Atlantic Basin, a lot of times even longer than that. And so there's just a lot more opportunity for a storm to get pulled northward by a passing cold front or trough or whatever. And so if the storms don't develop in the western or the eastern Atlantic Basin, and they stay a weak tropical wave, and they'll basically just pretty much plow straight westward, and then potentially develop in the Caribbean or off the East Coast or in the Gulf. And because it's developing much closer to the U.S., there's obviously less time for it to get pulled northward away from the U.S. Certainly, it could still run into Central America and not impact the U.S. at all, but generally, you do have a little bit of a higher risk for a storm to actually impact the U.S. if it does delay its development until it does get closer towards North America continent.
Awesome, thank you. So Mike, got over 2,000 people watching us on this webinar today, and they're wondering what kind of information can we get from WDT should the tropics get active as we think it will probably happen as we get into September here.
Sure, and that's great. And I really have 2 slides that I'm going to explain that, and then I'm going to showcase a new, very interactive map that we're going to be rolling out here to help build a complete single window view across the globe. So I'll start with the screen here as a quick recap of last year, 2017. So WDT meteorologists issued over 548 storm advisories last year, as it was a very active year. We ran some analysis and found that we averaged about 50 hours earlier than the National Hurricane Center. I'll touch on that a little bit here. And I'll just mention that we got our forecast accuracy to landfall very, very close. And we can share this information with people. And the reason I bring this up is not to be disparaging against the Hurricane Center. They do a very great job. In fact, you should know what the National Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service is forecasting because they drive news. The difference is they have a charter for public safety and what I call the path of least regret. So they'll throw a broad swath of where the impacts could be to affect the greatest amount of people. where we at WDT have and WeatherOps have the advantage of being specific to your asset, your location, and how it impacts you, with the whole goal being wrapped around keeping staff safe, customers safe, and keep revenue flowing. It's the concept of what I call the last to close and the first to open. And we really do that with three tenets. So I'll start in the middle here. This is our tropical suite of products we provide. The middle one that is highlighted, forecast, is really what I call situational awareness tools. And I can showcase some of these if you want, but for right now, I'll just highlight them. So we provide a daily planner of basin activity for anywhere in the globe, whether it's Atlantic Basin, the Pacific Basin, or wherever. And then we talk about actual tropical storm disturbances that we see, and that's where we get that lead time over the Hurricane Center, because we have some clients that are very sensitive to tropical storm effects. And then when a storm is actually named, we do or active storm advisories, which are really storm-specific information and where they go and what they do. And to the right of that, under guidance, we run some very sophisticated tools that are designed for a client's location, whether you're onshore or offshore. We run threat reports, which could be for single location or multi-location if you've got a whole host of assets. We run some things for the marine world called T-time reports, which is really a worst case scenario report if the storm comes straight at them. And then we can tie in a risk and response report the forecast to your actual business continuity response plans. So we can let you know that a threshold has been met for you to take step A, B, or C, or 1, 2, and 3, however you want to do that. And the beautiful thing about that is, on top of all that, we have a 365-day, 24/7 MET team that monitors assets around the globe. And we give our clients the ability to pick up the phone and talk to them to find out about more storm information. We actually have clients who set up conference calls daily during a major event. And then for the higher end clients we'll actually monitor a location for them and proactively reach out to them. And so it becomes a very powerful situational awareness tool that gives you a heads up of everything that's happening, specific guidance information, and then that whole MET support on top of it. Give you an example. If you have, say, a hotel chain along the coast somewhere, the East Coast, Miami, somewhere, wherever these storms are coming, and you know that a big tropical storm is coming, well, what does that mean to you, right? So we'll be able to tell you the time of arrival and the time of departure and the storm effects that's going to affect your location, so you can make really good mission critical decisions and be that last to close, first to open, keep your employees and your customers safe. So with that said, before we get to questions, I was asked to kind of show a new beta map here, and I'm just going to slide it over and blow it up. And I apologize to anybody who's on a low-speed internet, or sometimes webinars are a little kludgy when it comes to showing the stuff, but this is real-time live animated winds over the entire globe, and it's a street-level zoom. You can turn on locations. I've got radars. You can see I got tropical storms up there. It's really beautiful and really mesmerizing. And the beautiful thing about this map is we're basing this on our partnership with the ESRI. So if I have anybody out there as an ESRI customer, we're going to allow you the ability to log in with a single username, your Esri stuff, and you'll be able to drop in your own proprietary information on top of this map with our 140 weather layers. And now you've built a true common operating picture around the globe. And I'll just turn on another one here real quick that I zoomed in on the storms over Japan. You can see we've got Japanese radar. You can see we've got this tropical event coming in with the winds coming around it. And it now becomes a really powerful tool.
Need some weather decision support, we'd love to chat with you about that too, using our WeatherOps Commander platform. I feel confident that that we can take care of any weather needs that you need, whether it be through data or services, and integration with great partners as well. You can contact us a couple different ways at marketing@wdtinc.com. There's our phone number, 844-994-2278. You can always visit us online at weatherops.com. We even have a few of our members on the team on there on the chat at all hours, so you can ask questions while you're on the website or submit forms, and we'll get back to you quite quickly so that we can assess your threats with weather and build a plan to make sure that you can manage all the weather risk that may impact your business. So again, we thank you so much for joining us today. Steve and Mike, always appreciate your guys' insight and information. We don't want hurricanes to impact, but it's certainly still possible, even if it feels like it's been a quiet start to the hurricane season. There are certainly signs there that if a storm gets close to the United States, it have a chance to be a strong one. So we need to keep our eye on that, and that's why we're here to make sure you have all the information you need. So again, thanks for joining us for today's webinar, and we look forward to chatting with you soon. Thank you.